Okay, everybody, welcome to our final Exodus. I have to say, this is a disappointing climax, so don't expect the big band ending. It's not that kind of a book, right? Okay, so before we dive in, question, comments, reactions, anything anybody wants to raise before we get into it. Go ahead, Diane.
I want to know why Aaron got off so easily.
Mm,
I mean, he's the one who said, take your jewelry, give it to me, we'll make the golden calf. And yet there were no consequences for him, even though God was going to kill a bunch of other people. So
yeah.
was he that chosen, or maybe there's a context or a lesson there?
Yeah, I think there's also a little misogyny if you look at how Moses' sister Miriam gets treated later on in the Bible for doing something, for challenging Moses. They leave her behind. They walk off and leave her behind. Aaron leads a full-on insurrection and rebellion. And so, well, my immediate reaction is a little misogyny on that one, but also Aaron is, one of the leaders, one of the esteemed leaders that's going to go on from here. And so you could say the same thing about, some of the things that disciples pull in the New Testament, and how we look back, and you can look at the progression over the New Testaments and think, wow, they got like a PR representative at some point, and um, image really got remade from gospel to gospel. And it's less about that individual than it is about how that community was telling that story and what they wanted to remember about that person. So that's probably the best way to think about it. So, anything else? Go ahead, Paul.
I have to ask, has anybody made a drawing of this?
Yes.
Drawing,
It would be so helpful. I mean, I don't even know what a cubit is. I looked it up and I still don't know. So
Oh, yes. This was a big project sometimes at summer camps and things like that for Sunday school groups. They make this and they have little diagrams.
oh,
It's
really?
a big deal. I mean, I'm not sure what that lesson is for teaching in Sunday school, but it's done.
It fills up time.
Okay, I'm going to dive in then and let's start. So this is the last of Exodus. So let me just change something here and we'll get into it. Okay, we have been through a lot. Today we are finishing up with rebellion and moving forward. Okay. Central tenet of Exodus. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God, even when times get tough, even when you rebel. And that's what's about to happen, right? Okay, so we've been through the prelude. We've lived through the plagues, the departure, the journey to the arrival at Sinai, the giving of the laws, perhaps one of the blandest, driest sections of the Bible. And now we're finishing up with rebellion and the tabernacle. So last week, Moses got a lesson in distributive leadership and sharing of the wealth and power from his father-in-law. And then after 3 months on the road, they reached Mount Sinai. The 10 Commandments are given, and a whole bunch of additional laws are given. And what we talked about last week, remember, was these laws very much are in alignment with other ancient cultures. What was different were the initial commandments related to the exclusivity of Yahweh, and then kind of the sacred phrasing of them. Other than that, they were very much what you would find in other ancient cultures. So, and Moses spent some times up on the mountain, right? So he's up there for quite a while. So what's about to happen is the golden calf is about to get made. And God is going to send a plague on the people. So not the Egyptians this time. This is a plague for God's people. Moses is going to get pretty angry. He's going to throw the tablets. God's going to send the Israelites forward to the promised land. Moses is going to make new tablets, and the covenant is going to be renewed. And then there's going to be some writings about the tabernacle, the ark, and the temple, and then it ends. It's a very anticlimactic ending for those of you who have done it. There's no big conclusion. There's no big climax. It just kind of drifts off, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay, let's start with Exodus 32. This is a pretty climactic scene where full on rebellion. Would somebody like to read that one?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Tony.
When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us. Who shall go before us? As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them and formed them in a mold and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." As soon as he came near the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned hot, and he threw the tablets from his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf that they had made, burned it with the fire, ground it to powder, and scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people because they made the calf, the one that Aaron had made.
This is quite the reaction, right? So this is what you might consider an overreaction. And we're going to talk about why it was so extreme. There is some amazing art about this scene. So remember back to when they left Egypt, what they took? They took all of the gold with them. So they were going to melt it down. Moses is off. They start to doubt that Moses is ever going to come back. And so Aaron steps in and says, "Okay, let's worship the way we probably remember worshiping, which is to pagan gods." And Moses is going to come back, and remember the number one rule here is you will have no other gods but me, right? So Moses is furious. God is going to respond, right? Okay, so they're restless. Moses has been gone from a while, and so they confront Aaron, who's been in charge, and Aaron is the chief priest at this time. And because they don't know where Moses is, they doubt he's ever coming back. They have this sense of this loss of leadership. And remember, last week we heard about how Moses was the be all end all. He's the one that decided everything up until last week, right? So they had accepted that Moses was going to intercede with them. They had accepted Moses as their leader. Now they're in the middle of nowhere, having given up everything. So what they really want is a God who's going to lead them. And they had thought that was Moses' job, but he has left town with, no forwarding address to their opinion. So Aaron is going to comply, and he is going to take all of that gold that they borrowed from Egypt, melt it down, and cast it into a calf-shaped form, and then have a festival to worship that God, right? So the people are going to bring sacrifices. They're going to eat and drink and dance and make merries. This is one of those stories in the Bible that is probably less about this time and this period of story in the Ark of Moses and the Israelites than it is about things going on in ancient Israel. So there's a lot of stories that echo this theme throughout the Hebrew scriptures. Maybe you could change some of the details, but the fundamental tenets are the people get restless, they start to doubt God, they come up with their own images of God and worship them, and then God gets angry and calls him back, right? So but in doing that, they have broken that covenant, that agreement that they came to. And so those tablets that it was written on are worthless. So they can be destroyed. They don't have any more applicability. This figure of the calf has a really long history in ancient Israel. It is very strongly associated with the god Baal, son of El, who was represented as a bull. So intensely in Canaanite religion and archaeology, you can find images of the bull. And as these Israelites are in the process of separating themselves, finding their new identity, they're going to adopt some of the culture that was surrounding them. And this image of of Baal and the golden calf was a pretty preeminent one. So we like to think of, there's, the Hebrew Bible and Judaism, and then there's Christianity in the New Testament. And it's just not as clean cut as that, because these are stories written in ancient times, in ancient civilizations, surrounded by other ancient cultures with differing sensibilities and gods. And so the Israelites are forming their religion, their identity, surrounded by all of these different stories, understandings, and images of God. So they're going to weave themselves into the Hebrew scripture. It's not that it's plagiarism, right? It's just that as they start to develop their sacred stories, they're going to build on some of the archetypes that are there before them. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about something in here, this stiff-necked Israelites, right?
Yeah.
So, before coming down from the mountain, Moses has this conversation of God, where God sees the calf and declares his intention to destroy the stiff-necked Israelites entirely. And so this is, it says something, about this writer's understanding of God's relationship with Israel, that it's really not beholden to them based on any of their history, but it is because of their covenant and their contract, right? And if the Israelites aren't holding up their end, then God can go make another deal, right? And Moses steps in and kind of pleads on behalf of the Israelites. So let's go ahead and read this section.
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
The Lord said to Moses, "Go, leave this place, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, and go to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey. But I will not go up among you, or I would consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." When the people heard these harsh words, they mourned, and no one put on ornaments. For the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. For if a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, and I will decide what to do with you." Therefore the Israelites stripped themselves of their ornaments from Mount Horeb onwards.
Thanks, Chris. So this is actually a different account, this conversation between God and Moses. And remember, we have three authors at play, three authors woven together, so that doesn't make sense. It goes back and forth, repeating the story, but telling it in new ways. And this is the one how basically Moses, or God's really angry, and Moses is interceding on their behalf. And God calls the Israelites a stiff-necked people. So is that a term that's pretty familiar to people? People have heard that term either in a biblical or in a derogatory way.
Yes.
Here.
No,
Yeah.
I'd like to know more about that.
We're going to talk about it. So the term, it means to be obstinate and difficult to lead. So the Hebrew Bible uses it a fair amount when describing the attitude of Israel toward God. So this is one of several references that will exist in the Hebrew Bible. It was originally used to describe an ox that refused to be directed by a farmer. So when a farmer was harnessing a team of oxen to plow his field, he would kind of poke them with the spikies on the yoke, and that would make them speed up our turn. And an ox that refused to be directed in such a way was referred to as stiff-necked, right? So a stiff-necked animal or person refuses to turn their head in order to take a different path. So that's the context with which the Israelites will use that term as they write the Hebrew scriptures. Here's the consequence of how that term has been misaligned through the years. On January 30th, 1939, Hitler, speaking to the German Reichstag, called down destruction on a sinful Jewish people. His words echoed a theme common in anti-Jewish literature of the 30s and 40s, and he drew upon the imagery of stiff-necked people who displeased God so much. So here's what's happening, and I want to stop because this is a really, really important point here. The Israelites are creating stories about their challenges of becoming a people that walks with God and does God's work. So they are telling their own stories of struggle about their relationship with God. Throughout the centuries, Christians have used these stories to create and cherry-picked images out to create derogatory and offensive and anti-Semitic images of God, our images of the Israelites, all the way up to Hitler framing basically the final solution around the stiff-necked people, right? So it's just really important to know, why were those terms originally used? They made sense to the context of the ancient Israelites and their struggle to understand how to walk with God, but then to see the absolute destruction that happens when they are removed and taken out of context and used to destroy a whole people. Questions on that? Go ahead, Marilyn.
Not on that specifically, but on chapter 33, when I read that, one of the things that I got, again, looking back, that it was the priests that wrote all these down, right? And it seems to me they're setting up an argument here for the fact that there needs to be a priestly caste between the stiff-necked people and God to interpret God and when you think about where they are right now, they're the leaders of the people because in that situation, and intend to be when they return.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And I'll tell you, some of you might remember Dr. Erica Martin. She came and talked to us a few years back on ancient Judaism and first century Judaism. And, Erica used to describe the stories in the Hebrew Bible like this, like, imagine that you have like a very, very small subset, like a quartet from the high school band, and like 4 people out of this giant high school. And these 4 people end up writing down the history of those 4 years of high school. It's all from their perspective, and theirs are the only story that gets saved. The choir doesn't get saved. The rest of the band doesn't get saved. The football players don't get saved. The cheerleaders, the nerds, the kids out back smoking cigarettes. None of those stories get saved. Just this small set of the band, the band gets their story saved. That's the Hebrew Bible.
And that,
That's why it's so dangerous to draw big conclusions about an entire people, a race of people from these stories. But is there still truth to be found in them? Sure, absolutely, absolutely. Go ahead, Shirley.
Yeah, I was wondering, don't the Roman Catholics still consider the Bible to be all divinely written rather than by multiple? I mean, and then I was also wondering about the Russian Orthodoxy, since we had such a history of the pogroms in Russia. Did the Russian Orthodox Church line up with the Roman Catholic in terms of how they dealt with what was laid down in the Bible?
Yeah, and I should probably teach a whole class on this because it's really fascinating to see the split between Judaism and Christianity. What happens the first 100 years, right, as the split's emerging, and then what happens when Christianity assumes full power of the Roman Empire, right? And then when the split happens, you know, the Catholic Church and the Protestants have equal hands in kind of the anti-Semitic awful things that will occur. And some of it is tied to biblical interpretations, and some of it is just tied to economic interpretations and needs, and some of it is just tied to pure old racism and prejudices. So it's really a fascinating kind of study of what happens over 2,000 years in this relationship. So, okay, let's go back into it. So, severe consequences, right? From what happens from this. I will tell you, Martin Luther also is going to draw on a lot of this language and imagery and use it in some of the most violent writings late in his life. And then his writings are going to be, Martin Luther creates the final solution that Hitler's going to use 500 years later. And Hitler's going to add the concentration camps, the death camps. That's the only change from Luther's plan. So it's quite a history. This is an interesting take. I thought, I think we should have other words. So this is by Rabbi Nussbaum, who lived and died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Almighty God, look upon this people with favor, because what is now their greatest vice will one day be their most heroic virtue. They are indeed an obstinate people. But just as now they are stiff-necked in their disobedience, so one day they will be equally stiff-necked in their loyalty. Nations will call on them to assimilate, but they will refuse. Mightier religions will urge them to convert, but they will resist. They will suffer humiliation, persecution, and even torture and death because of the name they bear and the faith they profess, but they will stay true to their covenant their ancestors made with you. They will go to their death saying, Ani Manin, I believe. This is a people awesome in its obstinacy, and though now it is their failing, there will be times far in the future when it will be their noblest strength. It's a pretty powerful quote.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back to the story of Exodus, Exodus 34. Would someone read this one?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
The Lord said to Moses, cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning and come up in the morning to Mount Sinai and present yourself there to me on top of the mountain. No one shall come up with you, and do not let anyone be seen throughout all of the mountain. And do not let flocks or herds graze in front of the mountain. So Moses cut 2 tablets of stone like the former ones. And he rose early in the morning and went up on Mount Sinai as the Lord had commanded him, and took in his hand the 2 tablets of stone. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name, the Lord.
Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. Okay, so the story of the calf continues in the making of new tablets. So a second trip up the Moses up the mountain for Moses, and another 40-day and 40-night stay. So the people have been punished. And the covenant is back and forth. So because of that, a new set of tablets is required to archive the new covenant. As part of this, God's going to promise to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan as long as the Israelites promise to destroy all of the cult images and refrain from engaging in social intercourse with the Canaanites. So what that means is this agreement is contingent on 2 things: don't marry non-Jews, don't worship anyone but Yahweh. Those are the conditions, right? And then the relationship is born anew. So Moses assembled the congregation of the Israelites and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. For 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a holy Sabbath of solemn rest of the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in your dwellings on the Sabbath day." So there is a huge emphasis on Sabbath that is begun in Genesis and continues in Exodus. And there's a lot of ancient context for it in terms of taking that day of rest. There's also the ancient context of justifying a time of not work for enslaved people. So having a day of rest for enslaved people. But this is a theme that's going to continue on throughout Leviticus and throughout Deuteronomy and throughout Numbers, this emphasis on Sabbath. And I do think it's something that you see some of it mapping in the New Testament with Jesus' teaching. Interestingly enough, you're going to see some of the biggest conflicts he's going to run into with the Pharisees are going to be about what actions it's appropriate to take on Sabbath, because the Pharisees will be returning to this language, right? And how this language is interpreted is, on the Sabbath day, you do no work. There are course exceptions that if you have to save somebody's life, you save their life. The stories that we're going to encounter coming up in Matthew next month are where he heals on the Sabbath, are over an interpretation of, could this person have lived? Where the Pharisees are saying they weren't dying, they've had this for a long time. And Jesus saying, no, they need to be healed now, right? So this right here is going to be the context for a lot of the battles we're going to see in the New Testament that ultimately are going to get Jesus executed. Okay, I'm not going to have you read this. This is the description of the ark. It is Exodus 37. Here, for those of you in pulp culture, is where that description shows up, the first Indiana Jones movie. So that creation of that ark right there that's the passage Indiana Jones cites. And then that is the Hollywood recreation of the ark. So
A picture, Paul.
they're quoting Exodus right there.
Marci, what is a mercy seat?
I do not know what word is.
Okay. At the very last word in that paragraph.
It's the two ends of the mercy seat.
I thought that the Lord, or they had in previous chapters discussed how this was, I guess Moses or someone was supposed to sit on this and give judgments of mercy or
on top
not.
of the ark.
Right.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Will somebody read this one? Exodus 39 and 40. The tabernacle.
I will.
Thank you, Paul.
The Israelites had done all of the work just as the Lord had commanded Moses. When Moses saw that they had done all the work just as the Lord had commanded, he blessed them. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on each stage of their journey. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out until the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night before the eyes of all the house of Israel at each stage of their journey.
Thanks, Paul. Okay. Basically you could think of it, this passage that Paul just read, as, when the queen's now the king is in the castle, they raise the flag. That's basically what they're saying. When God's present, you'll see the cloud. When God's not there, you can head out. So, okay. Why does this all matter? So, there's a lot of elaborate descriptions in here about the tabernacle. A lot of scholars think that this is actually the description of Solomon's temple. This is the one that will be destroyed by Rome. Now some scholars think it's all a fiction invented by priests centuries later. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of this. The important takeaways are that this is the tabernacle is incredibly complex to build. You cannot do it. It takes enormous skill and enormous holiness. So going back to Marilee's point about, the priests, Marilee is kind of naming what a lot of biblical scholars believe, that it's actually priest descriptions of the tabernacle. There are a lot of connections here between the creation of the tabernacle and creation in general. So they're using that creation imagery that we saw back in Genesis, and that concept of the garden and where God dwells, and moving it now to a physical location for the people of Israel. So what's happening is basically what we learned in Genesis, applying to creation, is now showing up in more reality of how it will be lived out for Israel. Okay, what's next? So they're on the road between Exodus ending and them entering the promised land, which happens in the book of Joshua. We're going to hit Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're the only books in the Hebrew scripture where God gives these instructions directly to the Israelites. So it's very unique in those books. What will come after them is Joshua and Judges, and those are the history of the conquest. So that's where they cross the river Jordan. They take over the land and establish the courts and the judges and the nation of Israel. So Joshua, probably if you're going to read the next book, I would skip Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and I'd go to Joshua, which is a little more easy to read. Reads more like a book of a story. Judges is a compilation of lots of different stories and lots of different authors. It's more like a library. Joshua is going to pick up right where Deuteronomy is going to leave off. Joshua has taken over as the leader from Moses. Moses has died. He does not get to cross the river Jordan. He does not enter the promised land. So Joshua is going to deal with questions like how does Israel make sense of its relationship to the people who lived on the land before them? And foremost, how they worshiped and how they interact with them socially. Do they marry them? Those are the two big challenges that are coming. And then, this book, Joshua is really going to lean into the fact that the main story of the nation of Israel is that it violently overthrows another nation and takes over, right? So there.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. And there's conquest and genocide of the indigenous population that lives there. So Joshua is going to raise some really challenging questions that have been emerging ever since we started with Genesis. Okay, here's our discussion group. What can we take from the book of Exodus, and what do we leave behind? What do we take and what do we leave behind? Pretty similar to one we've done for all of them. So I'm going to give you about 7 or 8 minutes for that one, and then we'll come back and do that. What do you take from Exodus? What do you leave behind? And I do think it's important to grapple with how it is speaking to you in our contemporary times. It is pretty remarkable that we are dealing with this book of the Bible while everything is going on in the Middle East right now. So feel free to factor that in, and I'll see you back here in about 8 minutes.